It's not great, unfortunately. So many scientists have come to the conclusion, I guess you could say, that we really are in a dire situation, and it's now commonly referred to as what's called the Anthropocene. So it's the first time, I guess, in human history that we can really see the impacts of what we're doing on the planet at a large scale.
I've heard it said by some people that what we are actually living through is another of the mass extinction events, but this time, as opposed to it being caused by a sudden shift in the weather or a giant chunk of rock smashing into the Earth from outer space, it's being caused by us, by people.
That's right, yeah. So many people consider that we may be in the midst of the sixth mass extinction event. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the dinosaurs going extinct potentially because of an asteroid. Well, this time species are going extinct. And, in the future we certainly think at quite high rates, and mostly because of our own actions. So whether that be destroying forests, whether that be the introduction of invasive species which get rid of other species, or even the impact of climate change.
But it's not humans who are being wiped out, so why should we care?
Well, that's a very interesting point. It's not humans that are being wiped out yet. So we should care because we're completely dependent on other species. And you may be familiar with the term ecosystem services, which basically means that species, whether they be plants, animals, even bacteria, can give us lots of benefits in terms of what they do. So, obviously plants produce oxygen for us. They can store carbon. Animals, imagine things like bees, which are critical in pollination. And most of our crops require pollination, and bees do the work for us. Without these species, we will simply disappear. We won't have food. We won't have air to breathe. So it's really a flawed idea, I think, to say that we can do without these species.
You mentioned bees. If bees disappear, and there are threats to honeybees in some parts of the world, if they disappear, there's a lot of species that are suddenly in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and we're number one. We're heavily dependent on bees for a lot of our food crops. And we've already seen in parts of the world where bee populations have collapsed, in part due to impacts of things like pesticides and habitat loss, but also a little mite, which causes these bees to die. And now what we're having to do is to move bees around from orchard to orchard or from crop to crop to help pollinate these areas. And if you can think about how much that costs to do, so you have to pay to have someone with a hive of bees, put it in a truck, drive it around from crop to crop. That all costs money. Now, if you think about it, naturally, when the bees are happily, they're doing that for us for free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So when we lose species and we lose the services that they perform, we have to start paying for it. And sometimes we can't even replace those services anyway.
So why don't we just get out there and start breeding more bees?
Yeah, well, exactly. It's not as simple as that. Obviously, all species are related, or are connected, if you like, to other species. So we can't favour one over the other, because if one species gets out of control, that's going to have effect on others. But certainly, yes, we can sort of promote areas that might be good for bees. So if we know that they use a particular type of habitat, then we might want to preserve those habitats nearby to farming areas, and that might, of course, help to increase things like pollination. So there are definitely things that we can do.
But if we can't promote one species over another, where does man fit in? Are we more valuable than some of the other species, or do we have to learn our place and perhaps revise our own perception of our own value?
I think that's an excellent point. I think we have to work with nature, not against it. So, yes, we can certainly prioritise animals or plants even more over some others, but we don't want to sort of let that get out of hand, I guess is what I was trying to say. But we certainly need to live in balance more with nature, and right now I think it's questionable whether we're doing that. So if we are able to preserve more species, I think we'll certainly see better outcomes.
Couldn't it also be said, though, that working with nature would be finding ways to increase the yields of crops or to boost the numbers of threatened species that are vital to the food chain?
Absolutely, and there's amazing ways to actually increase the yield of things while still conserving them. So you look at things like marine reserves and fishing reserves. So if you set aside areas where fish can breed, they then spill over into areas which can then be fished, and you're actually better off doing that than you are just fishing the whole area. So yes, in some cases we can actually have our cake and eat it too, but we have to be clever about how we do that.
And how can we be clever?
Well, the example I just used, imagine if you have a fishery and you want to have a sustainable fishery and you want to have increased yields, one thing to do, of course, is set aside key areas where fish can breed without being fished heavily, and then they actually then spill over into areas that can be fished. But likewise, going back to the example using the bees, if we can set aside more areas for bees or other species that might be of interest in an economic sense to then actually perform the benefits we need, rather than just clearing land for other purposes, then we're going to have a better outcome overall.
Now, there are some species that have gone extinct since in recent years that have been very well recorded that they've gone extinct. Things like the dodo and the Tasmanian tiger. Was there really a major environmental flow-on when the dodo disappeared or when the thylacine became extinct?
In the case of the dodo, I couldn't actually say, and that's questionable, but in the case of the thylacine, certainly yes. So you may be aware that Australia has a really poor record of conservation, and particularly our mammals. So we've lost over 20 species of mammals since European settlement. And one of the main reasons for that is the impacts of feral cats and foxes. And one of the things that controls smaller predators like cats and foxes is larger predators. So not having thylacines, which would have actually controlled those animals and reduced their impact on other smaller native mammals, is a big problem, which is why we now look at something like the dingo, which of course is a more controversial species because it was introduced relatively recently, but it's essentially fulfilling the role of the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger. But we don't always have a replacement for one species for another.
You mentioned cats and foxes. I don't want to pick holes here, but the cats and foxes are introduced species. If we hadn't introduced those, it wouldn't have mattered. Thylacine had gone extinct, would it?
It still would have mattered. Introducing species is probably never a good idea, but the impacts are worse because we've already lost the thylacine. So that's what I was essentially highlighting, that, right there with the thylacine, and you can put the dingo in the same basket, that we have animals performing a role. So they're actually helping to do things that cost us money. So if you think about cats and foxes, it costs us money to control those. It costs us money to control kangaroos. So we have to spend money shooting kangaroos to keep their numbers down. Dingoes actually do that for us for free. So they're out there, they're eating kangaroos, again, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're doing that for free. When we get rid of dingoes, we see more kangaroos. We have another problem to deal with, let alone cats and foxes. So you can see how living with species and knowing what their roles are is really important.
What about the threatened species list? How's it looking right now?
It's not looking good at all. So, as I said before, Australia has a really poor record, in particularly for its mammal conservation, but you can also put other groups in there as well, things like birds and others. We've lost over 20 species of mammals already, and in Northern Australia, we're now seeing a lot of mammal species declining as well, including in really well-funded national parks like Kakadu National Park. So there's a real concern that we're about to witness another extinction event on quite a large scale for our mammals, and that applies to a whole range of other groups as well.
What would be the most threatened species in Australia at the moment, or what would be some of them?
Well, in terms of the most critically endangered, if you like, that's things like the northern hairy-nosed wombat, which has probably got less than 200 individuals left on the planet. And they're obviously only in a very small area of Queensland, so they really are on the brink of extinction. But then there's a whole range of species which are still very close to extinction as well in parts of Northern Australia and elsewhere. So there's the orange-bellied parrot being another example in Southern Australia, less than probably a couple of hundred breeding pairs left in the wild. So there's a whole range of species in different parts of Australia that really are on the brink of extinction.
Do you think people care?
I think people do care, and I think it's a little bit of us needing to, communicate the message better about why species are so important, but also people really needing to realise that without these species, we are really going to be in a lot of trouble.
Indeed. Anything else that we need to think of when we think extinction or endangered species, Dr. Ritchie?
Well, I think the main thing I'd like to highlight is that once we lose these species, they're not easily replaced. And as I said before, many of these species actually are performing roles for us that actually are beneficial. So again, going back to the example with forests, trees absorbing carbon, reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, dingoes controlling kangaroo and fox numbers, bees pollinating. These things cost millions of dollars to actually do ourselves, but they're doing it for free. So that's why we should value these species.
Dr. Ewan Ritchie, good to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.